Hello and welcome to The Interview. I'm Mark Rogerson. I'm joined today by Dan Jørgensen, a Danish member of the Socialist Group who, as well as sitting on the Parliament's Environment Committee, is also part of the team who will be travelling to Copenhagen in December for the World Environment Summit. Dan Jørgensen, what are you hoping to achieve in Copenhagen?
Well, basically, there's one achievement that we really need, and that is to make an agreement that will make sure that the increase in temperature will stay below 2 degrees. That's the basic goal that we're all looking for. Then, of course, all the details, all the stuff that needs to be in the agreement, that's the difficult parts. How much are we going to reduce? How are we going to finance it? What kind of a trading system for emissions are we going to deploy? And stuff like that.
Your group, you're going as observers rather than fully fledged delegates, if you like. What can you actually achieve while you're there?
Well, me personally and the other parliamentarians are there really to be advisors to the negotiators from the European Union. We're also there to make sure that they stay within the mandate that we've given them, because what the European Union negotiators are going to be negotiating on behalf of is really some legislation that we've already made in this House, in the European Parliament. So these are the reasons why we're there.
Now, in the sort of 18 months run-up to Copenhagen, of course, we now face the worst recession in living memory. People say policymakers can only really think of one thing at a time. Is there a danger that concern about the environment has, as it were, been pushed to one side and replaced by concern about the economy?
Oh, very much so. It's a very big and real threat towards the possibility of having an agreement. I think, though, that it would actually be quite a misunderstanding if that happens, because really what we need to do is create an economy in which the green policies that we're hoping to lead will in fact create jobs, will in fact see to help us improving our economy and go forward instead of leading to more recession. So it shouldn't be looked at as if we're either solving the economical problems or solving the environment problems. We need to do both at the same time.
But part of solving the environment problems is inevitably going to mean higher energy costs. And just at the moment, higher costs is not what people want to hear about.
Well, first of all, that's not necessarily true, because part of the solution is also saving energy. And for you and me, if we save energy in our normal households, we will save money. This also goes for big industry. If they save energy, they also save money and become more competitive.
One of the big differences between Copenhagen and the summit in Kyoto, which started this whole process, if you like, is that now the Americans are on board.
Yes.
They're no longer just sitting on the sidelines saying, we don't actually believe in global warming. What difference do you think that's going to make when everybody gets around the table? It
makes a huge difference. There are 3 big polluters in the world. China is the biggest one. They are responsible for 20-some% of the CO2 pollution in the world. America is just below that, so they're the second largest polluter, and Europe then combined has around 15 or 16%. So really, if we don't have these 3 big players as a part of the agreement, then there's no chance of us achieving the goal, and that is, as I said earlier, to keep the increase in temperature below 2 degrees. America is in many ways the key player.
And yet, President Obama's environment package is in the queue behind his healthcare package in the American legislature. The healthcare package is facing problems. Is he actually going to have anything to deliver? And if he doesn't, does that just stop everything? Well,
Obama's been very clear. He's promised leadership on this. Right now, the EU are the leaders. We've said we want to decrease our CO2 emissions by 30% in the year 2020 compared to 1990s levels. Now, that makes us the leaders in the world. But this is also necessary if we are to obtain our goals. Now, what Obama needs to do is he needs to match that. He said now, well, he will stabilize the levels of emission in 2020. That's not enough. He needs to go well below that.
But is he coming to Copenhagen with the political mandate to do that?
Well, he doesn't actually have the mandate yet, because the American Congress haven't made legislation. We've made legislation in the EU that gives our negotiator that mandate. But in a way, that might not be that negative, because they can make the legislation afterwards. And if they had already made legislation now, chances are, I fear that, well, I'm almost certain that that would have not been ambitious enough. So it's probably better to have the Americans make an ambitious deal in Copenhagen, and then let's hope that they can then get it ratified when they go back home. You have to remember that in Kyoto, the Americans were actually there. Gore actually did sign, but then when he came back as vice president and him and Bill Clinton had to get it through the American Congress, they couldn't. I think Obama has a stronger political backing than they did.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago these targets, and a lot of the targets use 1990 as the baseline. There's talk of changing the baseline. To an outside observer, this looks like moving the target to absolutely guarantee we hit it without any difficulty.
I mean, how they do it technically, what we agree on technically, for me, isn't really that important. If they want another target line, it doesn't matter for me.
As long as it means
real reduction.
Yeah.
And, you know, we need in 2020 and in 2050, those 2 years are quite important because this is where the United Nations Climate Panel tell us if we don't reduce by this much in 2020 and by actually 20% in 2020, maybe even more. Actually, it's between 25 and 40% now, they're saying. And then in 2050, it's 80 or 90%. So if we don't hit those two targets, then we won't obtain our goal. And the goal, as I've mentioned a few times now, is keeping it under 2 degrees, the increase in temperature. Now, why is that? It's because after 2 degrees, if we go higher than 2 degrees, then we will have so many different effects in nature that makes it impossible to stop the process. Then everything will go wrong. Then the ice will melt. Then the whole thing will be very difficult to stop.
Yeah, I mean, this brings us very
That's why
neatly
it's 2 degrees. It's not just a political deal. This is nature. You can't negotiate with nature. 2 degrees is the target.
Well, that brings us very nicely to the situation in the developing countries, where nature plays an even greater role. Increased flooding, increased drought.
Yes.
The Maldives, for example, could disappear altogether. But these developing countries are coming to Copenhagen with a very different agenda, a very different set of priorities. How are we going to square that?
It's a very difficult question because it's a very diverse group. On one hand, you have the poorest countries in the world, the ones that will be hit hardest also by the effects of climate change. On the other hand, in the same grouping, we have also China, who is a developed nation, but is also part of the problem because they emit a lot of CO2. So what to do? Well, first of all, we need to understand that these countries still have a lot of people that are starving. As long as you're starving, you're not really that concerned with the environment. On the other hand, they know that on a long term, they need to be concerned. So what we should do is help them maintain a growth, maintain development, but do it in a different way than we've done ourselves, a polluting way. We need to help them to a green growth. That means money on the table. So the developed countries, that is EU and the United States of America, need to first of all have our own targets of mitigation, but second of all, be able to give the financing, the money to the poorest countries of the world to help them also maintain growth.
The World Bank has calculated that this sort of assistance to the developing world could cost anything between 150 and 650 billion dollars a year. I mean, these are numbers which make even the banking crisis start to look small.
Well, they look really big, and they are big, but, you know, the numbers, if you try and calculate what it will cost if we don't do anything, are much bigger. Plus, this is also a moral question. What will happen? Well, we will have massive migration, refugees, environment refugees in Africa, in the Middle East, different places in the world. We might even have wars, conflicts about this because there's such a scarcity of resources in the future if we don't solve this problem.
I accept the moral argument, I really do. But at a time when government deficits are already stretched to breaking point, where's this $600 billion going to come from?
Well, one thing that's extremely important is that we make sure that it's new public money. They can't just take them, the money that has to be paid from the rich countries, our own countries. We can't just take them from development aid that's already been given or been promised to give. We need new money. So where they're coming from? Well, we simply have to find these in our national budgets, because if we can't, then in very few years this will be an even bigger problem and it'll cost us even more money. But this is not only about money, but if it were.
Yeah, let's have a look at some of the particular issues affecting the developing world. For example, deforestation.
Yes.
Not perhaps as sexy as 20% by 2020, but huge impact on the environment.
Oh, extremely important. 20% of all the pollution in the world of CO2 comes from forest degradation and deforestation. So this is really one place where we can do a lot, also with a lot of other positive effects for biodiversity and the local indigenous people and all that. we really need to make sure that we save, especially the rainforests, and it is going to be a part of the Copenhagen deal. We need to be able to find some sort of financing so that we can pay the poorest countries not to chop down their trees.
There's a lot of talk about using green technology
Yes.
to help the developing world. The counter-argument to that is that the technology is great, but it takes time. And anyway, most of this stuff is patented in the West, and the patents cost a fortune. We're coming up with good ideas, but we're in danger of not delivering.
Very much so. One of the ways to solve this problem is to make sure that industry in the rich part of the world, that is also in Europe, have incentives to actually share that technology. Now, one of the reasons, or one of the ways that we do that is we say, you have to reduce with X% every year. Now, some of that reduction, you can actually, instead of doing it yourself, you can help fund projects and give technology transfer to projects in the developing countries. This has a clear positive economic effect in our countries, and it will help create the transfer of technology that we want. So I think that's a pretty good way of doing it, but we have to make sure that our industry then doesn't just pay for all the emissions, because they need to do some themselves, obviously, also.
If the final deal involved commitments, firm commitments to cut, firm targets for the developed world, but slightly softer commitments, slightly easier terms for the developing world, would you see that as success or failure?
Well, that would be a success. I mean, and there's no way around that, because look at China. They still have 500 million people living under the poverty level. Now, these people have, of course, I think, a very legitimate aim and target, and that is to become rich. Not rich, but to at least have a growth that will mean that they won't starve. Now, this goes for many other countries in the world also. We cannot deny them of that target, I think. So, in order for them to maintain that growth, they will also even have an increase in CO2 emissions for some years, but then we'll need them to put a clear year of when they will start to flatten out that curve and when they will start reducing, whereas we have to start reducing right now, and we have to do it as soon as we can. We have to remember, it's the richest countries in the world that's been polluting for the last 200 years that have created this problem. The developing countries are not really the big sinners. They might be eventually if they don't start reducing.
We got us into
stage.
this mess.
But we got them into this mess.
Yeah. Okay.
Got the world into this mess.
What happens if there's no deal?
Well, it can have catastrophic consequences, because really this is not. It's not only a discussion about whether or not we'll hit the 2 degrees, and then is it 2.5 degrees or 1.5 degrees? Does that really matter? Yes, it matters, because the scientists tell us that if the increase in temperature is above 2 degrees, then we can't stop it. Then within the end of this century, it might be 6 degrees. Then the North Pole will melt, the South Pole will melt, Greenland will melt. The rise in the sea levels in this world will be maybe 5 to 7 meters.
But with the different
deserts, it's really, you really cannot underestimate the dangers if we don't do this.
But in the real political world, Europe has one position, the States another, the BRIC countries another, the less developed countries another. You know, you're a politician. How realistic are the chances of bringing all these disparate groups together?
Well, I'm extremely concerned. On the other hand, Barack Obama really has done a lot of progress on many issues in the United States. He's really engaged in this. He knows how serious it is. China, they have a lot of course, problems on reaching the targets that we want them to. They have a lot of other problems to struggle with, but they are also a country that will be hit hard if they don't do something. We are now in a stage where no world leaders of any big countries are any longer questioning that this is a problem. That's already something.
But the question I'm asking, really, if you like, is this the right way to solve it? Just getting all these people, all these political egos round the table and hoping for a result?
Well, maybe we need some egos, because if we have only civil servants sitting around the table trying to make very technical deals and finding all kinds of technical reasons why this can't be done, then then maybe it won't be done. Maybe we need Obama or Sarkozy or Hu Jintao from China to come to Copenhagen and say we need this, and then afterwards the civil servants can find out how we do it technically.
In one word, are you optimistic or pessimistic as you book your ticket for Copenhagen?
Ooh, I can't, some days I'm optimistic, some days I just want to cry, because really, to think about if this isn't, as you says, is really terrible. On the other hand, we have a historical chance, so let's make it happen.
Dan Jørgensen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.